everybody. Thank you for joining us today for another dataPARC webinar. Today we'll be discussing or presenting capitalizing on ChatGPTs for coding assistance and helping to use that to unlock new possibilities in PARCgraphics. So I am Aaron Mosier, and I'm joined today by a colleague of mine, Richard Chinnis.
Hey Aaron, hey everybody. Happy to be here. I'm excited about this topic. I use it a lot.
Yes, I think this will be an interesting topic for a number of people to find out more information about. So first of all, some quick kind of housekeeping. As we do the webinar, please feel free to ask questions during the webinar, and we'll try to either answer them at the end or as we go, or reach back to you. And if you have any sound issues or the sound's breaking up, sometimes calling in instead of using your PC helps. And of course, if you have any questions, because you maybe get bumped out, please email us at the attached address. And also for additional resources or a recording of this webinar, it'll be posted up on our community forum with the address there, or you can get through it through our dataPARC address. Now I'll hand it over to Richard to discuss using ChatGPT with dataPARC.
All right, thanks Aaron. Welcome everyone. This quick agenda of what we're going to go through in this webinar. We'll talk about ChatGPT in general, and that also sort of means large language models in general and what that is. Not going to get into the nuts and bolts of those things, but just enough understanding so that we can see how it relates and is useful to us as dataPARC users. We'll look at a couple of use cases, some examples, some use cases that are just bullet points that you can use to sort of get your own juices flowing, and maybe how you could use it in some of your graphics or advanced formulas. And then we'll talk about the specifics of using specifically ChatGPT and dataPARC. We'll talk about some of the differences with BARD or some of the other large language models, but the example and the demo that we're going to use and the key terms that I have learned from ChatGPT, you could say, are going to be ChatGPT specific. And as I said, the demo, we will get code from ChatGPT. There are lots of different ways to use ChatGPT, but this is going to be very specific to dataPARC. And then we'll look, I'll actually show in the demo implementation, putting the code in, editing the code, saving it, and you'll see, hopefully, a running graphic with some ChatGPT assisted code behind. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So if we get into the ChatGPT overview, as I said, I am not even capable of describing everything behind these large language models. But what is ChatGPT? As you can see in the screenshot there, this is the opening web page for OpenAI's ChatGPT. It is a publicly available AI tool. There's lots of debate about what AI is and whether you can call this AI and all those things. That's a useful term, and we're going to use it. It's an AI tool. And we say publicly available rather than open source because the GPT, which is Generative Pre-trained Transformer, that's what that stands for, is owned, or that's specific to the company OpenAI. They have not made that GPT model open source. Like, I can't go in and get all the guts of their GPT model, but they have made the interface to it public. So that's why we say publicly available AI tool. There are lots of open source large language models out there. And ChatGPT is the public-facing side of that large language model, which is GPT. So how does it work? This is going to be very basic. Anyone who knows anything about neural nets is probably going to argue with me or have complaints about how I describe this, but I'm just describing it from a user's perspective, and the way it's been described to me in simple, childlike terms is that it's a probability engine for words, for language. You'll see LLM a lot of times when you're looking at these AI tools, and that just stands for large language model. It's very simple. Large chunks of languages have been fed into these neural networks, and they're predicting the next, most likely next word. So you can start a sentence and you can just feed that into these GPT, ChatGPT or large language models, and they will finish the sentence with the most probable next word and next word and next word and next word. The real, I would say, and that kind of thing has been around for a while. The real leap, I would say, that's been made with GPT and the transformer model is the conversation length and really the horizon that you have for those predictions, those probability predictions. In the past, you know, the horizon was, you know, the last 10 words, or, you know, maybe the last paragraph, or maybe it was, you know, the last 500 words or 2,000 words or whatever. There was always a horizon. And the leap that's sort of been made with the GPT model and transformer type models is that once you begin the conversation, as you continue to add to the conversation, interacting with these large language models and ChatGPT in particular, they become better at predicting the next word because the horizon is always the beginning of that conversation. So as you increase your conversation length and in the interactions, you're asking questions, you're asking for clarifications. Maybe you even change the topic. Even if you change the topic and then you try to link two topics in conversation, it's better able to do that and predict the next word because it's using your entire conversation for its probability prediction. So that's a really basic description of how this works. It's working. It's pretty simple in that context. But if you get into the nuts and bolts, it's really pretty complex neural network. So what are people using this for, right? It's just predicting words. It's saying, okay, if one word is cat, then maybe the next word is jumped. Well, that's true. That's exactly what it's doing. But it's been fed all kinds of text, all kinds of language. It's a large language model. So people are using it for coaches. They can begin the conversation by saying, I am training for a marathon and you are my motivation coach. And here are things I'm having trouble with. What would you tell me to give me some motivation? And it just uses its probability engine to come up with the next likely word. And then the next word after that, and it finishes its feedback to you. They use it as sounding boards. They say, I have an idea. Tell me why this idea is good. Tell me why this idea is bad. Tell me some alternatives for this idea. And it's not thinking about your idea. It's looking at the words you used and it's giving you the most probable next word. But those most probable next words are valid. Like those are the most probable words the people around you would probably say back to you as well. Idea and content generation. I mentioned earlier, you can start a sentence and it will finish the sentence for you. So people say, tell me a story about, you know, two dogs and 3 cats that go on an adventure. And it will just completely make up a story about that. And we'll talk about made up things in the future and how that can be also a bad thing. So there's lots of ways. Again, it's language based. So if you ask it to do math, it has trouble with that kind of stuff. Sometimes it gets it right if you tell it to show its work or do things step by step, but it's very geared toward words and language. So now if we zoom in a little bit and we say, okay, that's still, you know, a real 5-minute overview of large language model. What are the use cases for dataPARC? How are users or engineers able to use these things? So here are some ways that I've used it. I've seen used and I've heard it used, particularly in graphics coding. Many people who build graphics with our graphics designer never go into the code behind the graphic and I didn't know for a long time you could put code behind our graphics. I would just drag controls on, put numbers on, make things change color, make things change size, and that was my graphic. And I was perfectly happy with that. And that's fine. But you can actually start thinking of graphics as applications, even mature applications, when you start putting the code behind to handle lots of these things. So the things that gives you is improved user experience. You can make things more accessible by hiding information and showing information when it's needed so that they don't have to go to other windows or open other graphics. You can shape things, and you really can bring, I guess, animations and time-based experiences to it rather than just showing something or hiding it. Data grid has been a real help for me. I know that's a very simple control, but I'm not a programmer. I'm not a developer. And so I go to ChatGPT and I say, hey, tell me what kind of code I can use in my VB.NET to fill out this data grid with a SQL query record set. And it helps me do that. Storyboards are the animation that I mentioned. Really, a storyboard is actually a collection of animations. If you say, I want to, I want to move this thing while I'm changing its opacity, while I'm changing its size, well, you can put all three animations together in a storyboard, and the storyboard carries that out. I learned that in my interactions with ChatGPT. I didn't know that was a thing. Interfacing with SQL. I am terrible with SQL queries. I mean, I'm really legitimately terrible. I have to ask people for help all the time. Well, this has helped those people because now I'm asking ChatGPT instead of bugging my coworkers with lots of SQL questions. And even WPF binding. This is something that I have done. Our graphics engine, our graphics designer is built around WPF binding. You're binding things, tags and things using WPF binding. Well, you can actually go into the code and you can edit and make the WPF binding itself actually dynamic. I have done this. So I hover a mouse over one object that is bound to a tag, and that changes the WPF bindings of every other control in the graphic. And I hover over another one and it changes those bindings again. So you can do dynamic WPF binding. And then advanced formula coding. It's still useful in the advanced formula coding. It will have some limitations there because of our C class. The large language models that are public aren't aware of our C class. So things like PARC or PV values or PARC values or whatever, those things aren't going to be known by ChatGPT, but it can help you with the Visual Basic side of advanced formula coding. So here's an example of a graphic that has some ChatGPT help behind it. And I'm going to drag over and show you the live version. That was my prompt. So I'm showing this now live on my virtual machine. And here's a storyboard example. When I click on this box, it brings a view box in, or it hides a view box. So it's changing its width, it's changing its height, it's changing its opacity. So there's a show storyboard and there's a hide storyboard. And you can actually, use the same storyboard for lots of hidden things, right? And this is what I was talking about earlier with user experience. This is just an example of user experience. So they don't have to now go find information on this plant that's sort of hidden behind this. We can put that information in there, but only make it accessible when they need it, and keep the graphic nice and clean. So there's an example of a use case there. So now I do want to show an actual demo. I know this is this is bold, but I am going to try, and I'm going to succeed, I'll say, at a ChatGPT aided demo. Now, I haven't done any pre-work on this, so this really is a dangerous demo. The only thing I've done is I've created a blank graphic with a button and a rectangle. That's all I have. I haven't even changed the names, button and rectangle. And what I want to do is I want this rectangle to move to the right by 50 pixels when I click my button. Now, not long ago, probably earlier this year, I didn't know how to do that. So I would go to ChatGPT, and this is what the interface looks like. And what I have learned, and we'll talk about some of a list of things I've learned, when I need help with PARCgraphic, with coding behind PARCgraphic, I always start my conversations this way. I am creating a WPF application with VB.NET code behind, period. All of that is really key for this conversation, and it sets the stage for the entire conversation. I have a button and a rectangle on my canvas. I would like the rectangle to move to the right. It's very verbose. Actually, that's a point I should have made earlier. The more verbose you are with these large language models, the better your responses are, because you're giving it more words to use in its probability calculation. So even full paragraphs sometimes are very helpful. Like the rectangle to move to the right by 50 pixels when I click the button. How, well, what will I need in my code behind? Now let's see if ChatGPT gives me something that I can actually use. Okay, follow these steps. That's another thing. ChatGPT will give you English answer and code answer often. And also often it will explain or put comments in the code. So now it's giving the code behind. So when you give it the keyword and you say, I'm building a WPF application, that's when it knows that it needs to consider using XAML. And when you're giving it, when you say VB.NET code behind, it knows, okay, this is, it's not C or some other language. Also, when you tell it WPF, it knows that the type of VB.NET it needs to give you is not WinForms or Windows Forms VB.NET. These are all things that I've struggled through over the last few months, is, you know, telling ChatGPT I want Visual Basic.NET, but not knowing what the difference is between Windows Forms. So if I go up and look at my XAML now, I don't really have to, in this case, I don't really need to worry about the XAML, except to note that, oh, okay, it used the name move button and it used the name move rectangle. So I need to kind of take that into consideration, right? I didn't go through I could have up here in my, as I said, you can create these really long prompts. In my prompt, I could have told ChatGPT the name of my button and the name of my text block or my rectangle, and it would have used those names. I've done this in the past, but I'm not really going to worry about that. I'm really concerned about this. Okay, I want to copy this code. So you can do a copy code here, actually. And now if I go in here, I'm going to go into, actually, I'm going to go to my button, okay, to the animations. Anyone who's used buttons knows that in the event actions, you can change this to run script over here on the left. And the event is click. And then when you click the ellipsis, you'll get the code window. Okay, so here's button click. The subroutine was created. So I'm going to go ahead and paste all of what I copied from ChatGPT, but you'll see I need to delete a couple of lines. I don't need the private sub here. You see, that's the sub declaration. So you can clean this up by just copying what you need. And I don't need 2 end subs. And then I just want to tab this in some, make it look a little cleaner. So now we just take a look, and you see immediately I need to check this, okay? It's getting the left of moving rectangle. So this is where you have to take note of the names, right? I know that my name is rectangle 1, so I'll just change that name back and do the same thing here. Okay, and I just check to make sure that the name's right. Okay, the button 1 click is something that was generated by me from graphics editor, so that's fine. It's dimensioning a current left, it's dimensioning a new left, and it's setting the new left on rectangle. Okay, so let's build. I know I just added 3 lines of code, but I always build just to make sure that there's no errors. Set my changes, save, and I hope that it will move when I click the button, and it does. But it's really jerky. Like, that's no fun. So I can continue my conversation. And I do this all the time. I'm not doing this just for this webinar. I actually do this all the time. I say, you know, that was great. I always compliment it. That was great. But I want the rectangle to move like an animation. I would like it to take 1 second to move those 5 pixels or 50 pixels. How would the code behind change? Oh, to create a smooth animation, right? Again, it gives you the answer in English. It starts talking to you and saying, oh, okay, it's sort of repeating back to you. At least this is how I interpret it. It's sort of repeating back to you what you said for 2 reasons. One, again, it's not thinking this. I'm just saying this is kind of how the probability engine seems to work. It sort of restates so that you can check and see if it's trying to do what you want it to do. And then it gives you the code. And then it sort of explains the code it gave you. So I'm just going to go up. I'm not going to copy the whole. In fact, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so I can see here. I'm just going to copy what's inside the sub again here. Copy. And you also notice the imports here. You have to take notice of what imports it's using, just in case we don't already have those imports in our editor. So if I go back now to graphics editor and I go into my code, I'm just gonna wholesale replace what was inside my button. I'm gonna get rid of all of this. And I'm gonna paste what I copied. I'm gonna tab it over. Now what did I do last time, right? I checked the names. So it's dimensioning an animation. I don't need to worry about that. I need to, go back in here. I need to fix the name of my rectangle. It's dimensioning a new target. That's fine. The animation. Okay, this is something I should mention as well. Sometimes these names that are the same, sometimes these variable names, ChatGPT will use the same name as actually a class name. That becomes a problem. So you do have to keep an eye on that sometimes. Like here, storyboard, I already know this is going to be a problem. You see it's dimensioning a storyboard, but it's calling it storyboard. You can put in your prompt, hey, don't use the same names for variables or for objects as the class names. And it will not do that. I forgot to do that in my prompt. Okay. So here's the other name I need to change. Rectangle 1. Okay, and let's just do a build. Make sure everything is okay. Yep, looks like it's okay. Accept changes and save. Now let's reload my graphic and see if it works. Look at that. It moved 50 pixels and it took about a second to do it. So I know this feels kind of made up, but genuinely, earlier this year, this is the kind of process I was going through with ChatGPT. This is how I learned about storyboards and animations. So that is hopefully a useful demo for you guys. If I minimize all of this and get back to my screen here, there are some points I would like to make. Okay, prompting. You don't need to become a prompt engineer, which there are people who are prompt engineers now. But this phrase, I am creating a WPF application with VB.NET code behind, is key, especially the code behind thing. ChatGPT actually taught me that phrase. I know there are people out there who know that, probably listening to this or watching this webinar. I didn't know what that meant, but that's very useful. And it makes the interactions with ChatGPT much more beneficial and correct. And it gives you the coding languages you need, which are XAML and VB.NET. As you saw, and I mentioned earlier, in implementing the code, you do need to take note of those import statements. There are times where the import statements that are needed are not in there, but most of the time they're there. If you start doing really complex kind of things, sometimes you'll need to import like threading, that kind of stuff. You'll need to import some more classes, and classes in particular. I have had GPT create classes for me, write classes for me for objects that I needed to use later or create later in my graphic. And you need to know like where to put those classes. Make sure they're in the namespace, not inside the class unless it's going to be a nested class, which I've never done that before, but I'm sure there are use cases for that. I didn't specify it. Again, I kept my prompt kind of short this time, but dataPARC starts with a canvas. If you go into the XAML, you'll see that kind of the basic, or even in graphics editor, you'll see the basic object that you're building and putting things on as a canvas. That often in ChatGPT, it's a grid. So if you're using ChatGPT to get a lot of XAML, you have to be careful there, because just copying wholesale from ChatGPT XAML and putting that wholesale into PARCgraphics XAML can cause all kinds of issues. So you really just want to use the XAML from ChatGPT in terms of the controls themselves. Just copy like the data grid implementation over or something like that. But you can tell ChatGPT, hey, I'm using a canvas and not a grid. And that's kind of that last point as well, XAML versus VB.NET. I use it very, very little for XAML, once in a while, because you can incapacitate and disable a graphic by removing or overwriting things in the XAML, whereas the VB.NET is a lot more forgiving. It just, either the code you put in there won't work, but the graphical won't be completely disabled and corrupted. Testing code and graphics, as I said, like I always hit the build button because that can show you an exception that will otherwise crash PARCview and just saves you time. So just build a lot when you're using code that you didn't write and you're just copying and pasting. The limitations are ChatGPT is not aware of dataPARC's controls and classes. So you can't ask it things about PV text block. You can't ask it things about our specific controls. So you can use other controls as examples. So for example, if I want to move a PV text block around, well, don't tell ChatGPT you're moving a PV text block. Just tell ChatGPT you're moving a text block. The code will almost always be useful and applicable that way. Yeah, so the final thoughts on using ChatGPT. It really is a tool that removes some limits from PARCgraphics. It makes graphics really more like applications. So that means they can take a lot of your time. It means that the more functionality you put in there, the more error catching you have to put in there, the more anticipation you have to have of users making mistakes or users doing things that aren't intended. Catching exceptions when you're using lots and lots and lots of these other classes and methods and things. But it has an impact on the user. Like, I'm not just saying this because I kind of like, moving rectangles across the screen. Like, I've gotten feedback from the things that I've tried and experimented with from users who are like, that really, really helps. Like, it didn't tell me more about my process, but it made it easier to digest. It made me, it was easier on my eyes, my interaction, or whatever. So you can really start thinking of graphics as these applications. Notes and other public large language models. BARD is the only other one I've really used. There are tons and tons and tons of models out there that aren't just public, but are actually open source. The reason I use ChatGPT for coding is because every time I've tried with BARD, I don't really know how to prompt it correctly because it doesn't respond to me with what I'm looking for. It gives me a valid response in terms of large language models, but it's just not giving me the code that I need. Now, there have been all kinds of upgrades, and these things are getting upgraded every night, it seems like. So maybe that's a possibility with BARD. And BARD is Google's large language model that's public facing. Company policy and information sharing, right? Maybe Aaron will have some more comments on this, but I know you don't want to just go copying all of your code that you're writing for a customer or internally at Capstone. Copy that into these prompts because that is being saved. It's not just ephemeral and interacting in that. It's being saved because they're saving all these conversations and analyzing these well, now that code is potentially, right, out in the public and in the wild. So anything that your customer doesn't want in a newspaper, and anything you don't want in a newspaper, and anything Capstone doesn't want in a newspaper, I know newspapers aren't printed anymore, but stick with me here, don't paste that into a prompt. So be very wary of that. Ask questions that are generic like I did. I'm creating a WPF application. I mean, that's super vanilla, right? So those, oh, and there were some other final thoughts on this as well. I'm not in any way telling people that you need to use ChatGPT or Bard or anything to create graphics. That's not at all. This is just one of those things where if you're not a developer or a coder or programmer like me, it gives you a tool that lets you unlock that part of graphics. Because I was making graphics for years before ChatGPT came along. I was just going to Microsoft's documentation and reading through it, you know, page by page. Very painful. This just means I don't have to do that. So I think I'm gonna invite Aaron to jump back in here and see if there are any questions out there.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Richard. Very interesting for me too, because I haven't played with this nearly as much in this way before. I've been more of a casual user of, you know, write a 500-page essay for me in the style of Jerry Seinfeld or something like that. So I'm glad to see this use. Yeah, we do have a couple questions. One was just what ChatGPT version, for example, are you using? Is it the free one, the pay for one, or which?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I'm using the free one, so it's just a 3.5, I think, is the version that's public. I don't pay for the upgrades. There's lots of cool stuff you could do with that. I don't have time to really get into all that stuff, so I don't pay for it. You can now, because Bing has incorporated GPT-4 into Bing. I think you get like 30 prompts a day, maybe. You could use GPT-4 that way also for free, but you're only going to get 30 prompts, which for me will never be enough in a day. Like I prompt way too much. But GPT-4, I've been told, and I've read and heard that it is way better specifically at code than GPT 3.5. Yeah.
Okay. Another one is somebody's kind of asking is if you're asking it for another code snippet within the same conversation, is it good at using different variable names or the same variable names, you know, kind of as needed as based what you're asking it?
Yep, my experience is yes. It remembers the variable names it used for variables up above. Every once in a while, when I've gone, let's say I've gone away from the conversation for maybe like an hour or two, literally, and I go try to reinitialize the conversation, sometimes it loses that. So what I do is I just refresh the web page and then I open that conversation back up, and then it kind of reloads the whole thing again. So there's I think it's some web-based glitches or whatever, but in my experience, it has always given new variable names even to the same class, and it's remembered the variable names it uses consistently throughout that conversation. You go to another conversation and it really is starting from scratch.
Will ChatGPT recommend non-native libraries or references, or can you ask it to include open source libraries in its responses?
If they existed on the internet before September 2021, like if it was something publicly available and out on the internet and people were talking about it, and there were files and documents before September of 2021, ChatGPT will know about it and will either recommend or say, no, that won't work, that's a bad idea, or that's a good idea. That doesn't mean it's right or correct. Because I didn't really talk a whole lot about the hallucinations, but maybe that'll be a question that comes up as well. But if it's something that's in the last 3 years, it doesn't know anything about it, because ChatGPT isn't web. There are plugins if you pay for those things, but the base model isn't aware of anything from the last 3 years.
Okay, so I think that statement answers another question somebody asked, which was maybe just wishful thinking, but they're saying is if enough dataPARC users start using ChatGPT, will it learn more answers for common dataPARC questions? But it sounds like no, because ChatGPT is based on a data set in the past. It's not learning as we talk to it.
No, the learning that I mentioned in the conversation, that is ephemeral. The learning that it has in that conversation only belongs to that conversation. It's not affecting the model, the base model. So when I say it's learning, that's kind of a misnomer, because technically it has already learned and been trained, and the learning part of the neural net is done. I misused the term learning just as a way to describe what's happening in that conversation. It's not actually changing the model.
Yeah, it's just helping use the whole context of the conversation to build,
to predict,
called a probability of the next word, next sentence, because it has more context around your question.
Exactly.
I think we'll try to cover 2 more, or actually 3. One is just a general comment that came in from one of the colleagues watching that's saying, well, this explains why you're asking them less SQL code questions. So it sounds like you use this for SQL help too.
Oh, all the time. Yeah, I don't use it necessarily for SQL as often because I'm not interfacing with SQL as often, but every time I open SSMS, I have ChatGPT over on the side, because, and again, this is one of those things where you don't want to paste, the data structure of customer tables or our tables into the prompt. You just want to tell it what you're trying to do. And I can normally adapt that to my use case, my specific use case.
Okay, so last 2. One was you mentioned advanced formulas. And it sounds like you have used ChatGPT to help with some advanced formulas outside of graphics, just the scripted ones.
I haven't, but I have heard of others who have. Yeah.
Okay. And I know from our advanced formulas, and you mentioned a little bit about the C class and something like that, I can imagine it's going to get trickier, because of course ChatGPT is not going to be aware of some of the things that we require in there. But I imagine if you're asking, how do I loop through an array class or a collection or a dictionary and modify something like that, and it's going to help you with the middle part of the code, just like you did with the graphics. You didn't have ChatGPT create all the code. You went in and said, I have a button, I want to put a click event behind the button, and now you're filling in the code at the click event. Yep,
exactly. And so the way I think about it, maybe for the advanced formulas, is like you say, hey, this is what I'm doing with, as in your example, an array. I need to get this from the array. What's the most efficient way to code that? Or what's the way that's going to require the least amount of code, or it's going to take the least amount of time on the user's desktop or whatever. It will help you do that kind of stuff. But if you're going to ask it really specific questions like, how do I do read raw, or how do I parse this PARC value, it has no idea. Because it hasn't been trained on our proprietary classes.
Okay, so final question is somebody grabbed on to your word hallucinations, and I know you had explained that to me earlier, a couple minutes or a couple sentences on those.
Yeah, okay, hallucination is when the large language model states something so assertively and as a fact that is absolutely, completely untrue. It's not because the large language model has an intent to lie, or it's because it's trying to share facts and it's getting the facts wrong. It's just a probability engine. So when you say, I'm a chemical, you can tell ChatGPT, I'm a chemical engineer, write my resume. It will actually produce a full resume with all kinds of work experience and schooling and everything that is 100% fabricated, because it's just a probability engine. So that would be an example of a hallucination. Well, it also hallucinates in Visual Basic sometimes. Like it will claim that the code it gives you does exactly what you say, you'll paste it in, and it just flat out doesn't work. Every single time that happens to me, I go back and I say, that did not work. Sometimes I don't even have to tell it why. I will say that did not work, and ChatGPT will respond, oh, I apologize. It didn't work because of this. It actually re-examines its code and tells you what's broken, and then gives you new code that, in my experience, the second time around almost always works. Sometimes 3 or 4 times you have to go down. But those are examples of code hallucinations. Well, I mean, those are the ones you want to avoid, right? It does imagine sometimes things that are just not true.
And the thing you mentioned that helps is like build often. So
Yes.
don't have a long conversation, copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, and then hit the button. As you make changes, make sure so you can
Oh,
go
yeah.
back and basically say that didn't work, or
Yep.
you can probably even sometimes paste the error back in and say I got this error.
Yes, pasting the error back in, it does recognize the error, and it says, oh, there are 2 or 3 things that can cause that error, and it'll tell you in English, but you don't really care. But again, it's just this probability thing, and then it says, okay, this new code should specifically take care of that error. Yep.
Interesting.
Very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to wrap it up there. I appreciated your time. I learned a lot, and I hope others did. And if anybody else out there is frantically typing a question, don't worry, we will grab it later and get back to you. Or another thing we do is we will post this webinar up on our forum, and we may put your question at the bottom, maybe not referencing back to you, but we can answer it there to help kick off the conversation. So I appreciate everybody joining today. Richard, I very much appreciated you spending your time with us as well.
Thanks, Aaron.
And we'll talk to everybody next time. Bye.